Okay, as I've noted before, oftentimes we can't do the reliability and validity analyses for the measures that we're using, and we're going to be using existing measures that vendors are going to try to sell us to use or recommend that we use. Or, your friend at the next organization that you met at the local SHRM meeting says, hey, I use this tool and it's really great and you should use it. So what should you do to evaluate that assessment method? If you can't do the validation or reliability analysis yourself, then you are using existing measures, and therefore what are some of the things you should consider? Number one, make sure that you're examining any available validation evidence. So you want to look at the validation coefficients, you want to look at the generalizability of those, and make sure that you're using tools that you know are reliable and valid. Number two, identifying the possible valid uses of the measure. Again, we want to make sure we're using the measure as it was intended to be used. We cannot use it for groups of employees where it doesn't matter. For example, if you are giving a test for assessing whether or not someone's a good office worker, the last thing you want to do is to apply this to jobs that are not office work. For example, you don't want to give an office work test to people who are plumbers or who are electricians or who work in the field and dig ditches, right? Office work tests are targeted for people who do office work, and different sorts of tests are targeted for people who do different kinds of job classifications, whether it's manual labor or what have you. So use the appropriate assessment tool for the appropriate audience and the appropriate job category. Number three, establish a similarity of the sample groups on which the measure was developed. So you want to know things like, was it the same job category, all right? But we also want to know, was it only white males? Was it only white females? Was it only minorities? Was it only majority group? Was it a certain age? Was it a certain ethnicity? Did they use, was English the first language? Did they have English as a second language, skills? Know the sample and break it down based on demographics and to figure out whether or not this is a tool that could be used for your company. If your company is primarily women and minorities, depending on what kind of industry you might be working in, but you're using a tool that was validated on a bunch of white males, that's not going to work for you. Vice versa, if you're a company filled primarily with white males and you're using tools that were validated with women and minorities, that might not work either. We want to make sure that we're using it across categories and across demographics, that we know it's going to work in all those circumstances and that it's not going to have an adverse impact against particular groups. Again, make sure we confirm job similarity. Again, you don't use an office skill test for somebody who works in the field. They're not similar at all. But if there are similar KSAs that they're getting at, then you can use it. So the goal here is to look at the KSAs for the one job, the KSAs for another job, and to make sure that those KSAs are similar. And so when you are testing for that particular KSA, you know it'll apply in that particular context. Lastly, you want to make sure and ask for what adverse impact evidence there may be using a particular test, so that you know in advance to monitor that really closely. If you're not monitoring it, then you can get into some legal trouble down the line. So what are some important tips for candidate assessment? How do we think about using these when we're assessing our candidates? And there's a bunch of things that we need to be mindful of. It's not as simple as just choosing a test and implementing it and calling it a day. First of all, we want to make sure we are very purposeful in the measures that we use and why we use them. So when we do our job analysis, we need to be clear about what the knowledge, skills, and abilities are that are required for success on the job. And then when we are assessing our candidates, we are purposeful in choosing selection tools that are assessing those knowledge, skills, and abilities. Number two, using a variety of tools. If you use one tool, you may run into a problem because that tool doesn't assess every aspect of the KSAs needed on the job. And that tool may also have a reputation for having an adverse impact. So we want to make sure we use a variety of tools, not just a single tool, to assess different aspects of that individual and what they bring to the table in terms of their knowledge, skills, and abilities. Number 3, use measures that are as unbiased and fair to all groups as is possible. Nothing is perfect, but our goal is to make sure we're using tools that do not have an adverse impact and that treat people fairly, consistently across the board. With that, then we are obligated under the law, as you know, not only to make sure that our tools are unbiased, but we are obligated to make sure, in order to facilitate unbiased tools, and tools that we know will be fair, to have measures that are reliable and valid. The first step to making sure that we don't have unbiased, that we have biased data, to make sure we don't have biased data, or that we are making sure we are treating people fairly, is making sure that the measure that we use is reliable and valid. And we already talked about that in the last 2 mini lectures. We also want to make sure that the measures that we're using are appropriate for the target population. Again, you don't use an office test to test for somebody who might have a skill as an electrician and vice versa. You want to make sure that if your test was validated with a homogeneous group, that you're only using it with that homogeneous group. So all those things that you need to be really mindful of, as we've discussed in previous slides. Number 6, ensure that the administrative staff is properly trained. It's not enough to just simply say, here's a test, go do it, right? Or to even ask our hiring managers to just go ahead and go and interview them. We need to train the hiring managers to make sure they know how to do structured interviews. We need to train the HR staff who are going to be administering many of these tests, whether it's a selection test or a recruitment test or anything along that line. We are making sure that the HR staff has been trained in how to administer that test, whether making sure that all the conditions are fair and safe and the same for every candidate that comes through the door. And so making sure that that people are trained to be aware of those things is really important. The next item, ensure suitable and uniform assessment conditions. And that's what goes into that proper training, is making sure that everybody understands how important it is to have a similar situation, a similar context for every single applicant. We want to make sure that they all have the same amount of time to take tests. We want to make sure that they have similar comfortable conditions in which to ask to sit and take the test. We want to make sure everybody has the same opportunity to answer the questions in an interview, and that those questions are similar across the board for every applicant. If we don't have similar conditions, then we run the risk of having a bias attached to our results, and we'll be unable to make generalizations about whether or not that person is going to be the best person for the job. So in our training, right, we want to make sure everybody recognizes that suitable and uniform assessment conditions are essential. Everybody has to have the same context in which to take those tests. We want to make sure that we've got instrument security. We want to make sure that we're not giving tests that is easily found on the internet so that people learn how to fake the answers, right? So we want something that is going to be a little bit more challenging and that it is secure so people can't cheat. We want to make sure we have confidential results. So we don't want to say, well, you know, Mary Smith, who was in here last week, she scored higher than you did. And we want to make sure that that is confidential. So that when we look at the results, we know that that's not going to get out, that you scored high or low in a particular area that you shouldn't have. And we want to make sure that we're interpreting those scores properly. It's not enough to just say they got a 150. Well, what does a 150 mean? Is a 150 a good score? Is a 150 a lousy score? Making sure we understand how to interpret what those numbers are is really important. When we are designing our selection system, we have to recognize that selection errors are going to occur. As I've said in some previous slides, no selection tool is perfect. There is no way you're going to have one that is 100% accurate every single time. Why? Because there's a lot of variability in our measures. So we're going to have some measures that are more reliable than others. And no measure is 100% reliable. And the same thing with validity, right? Our validity coefficients don't approach 1. We'd love them to, but we know that they don't. So our tools that we use are not 100% perfectly able to predict every outcome that we want. So when we recognize that there are some flaws in it, all we're really obligated to do is the best that we can, the most valid, the most accurate tools that we have available to us. But we cannot expect, in using the most accurate stuff available to us, that it's going to be a perfect predictor every single time. So what we're really looking for is recognizing how to minimize errors in a more systematic way, because every instrument's going to have some variability. We want to be careful of selection errors. For example, having a false negative, where we don't hire somebody who actually would have done really well on the job, and vice versa, not hiring somebody. If you hire someone who was not successful, that's a false positive. A false negative meaning we didn't hire somebody we should have, and a false positive means we hired somebody we shouldn't have done. So how do we manage that? Well, one of the ways that we manage that is by really looking at where our cutoff scores are. And we may have cutoff scores that are too strict, and that creates a problem with false negatives, or it's not strict enough, which creates a problem with false positives. So one of the things that we have to think about as we're setting up our assessment system and our selection system is to make sure that we have the cutoff scores set in such a way that makes sense, that we are minimizing our negatives and minimizing our false negatives and minimizing our false positives, and working through it that way. So the next slide asks the question, and it's a really important question: why do organizations conduct assessments even though there are still going to be selection errors? Because we're looking for a system that gets us a better result than if we had sort of randomly chosen someone, or if we said, I'm looking at one characteristic, that characteristic is fine, I'm going to hire them. They don't have that characteristic, I'm not going to hire them. So when you use a single observation, or if you use random assignment, hire, not hire, hire, not hire, randomly, that's not going to be good enough. We need to make sure that the tools that we use, even if they have errors, are going to give us a better result than if we had randomly selected people. So that's the goal. The next thing to consider, though, on this is really, we're not looking for one-dimensional people, right? We're not looking for a person who can perform on one thing and one thing only. We are looking for a more holistic perspective, a whole person approach to things, which means that you're going to have some selection error, and we get people aren't perfect. Neither are the selection tools. But what we want is to use a variety of tools that get at different aspects of the KSAs needed for the job, and that will improve the likelihood that we're going to hire the best person. If you use one selection tool, you increase the likelihood of having errors, and you increase the likelihood of having a system that is no better than random selection. Right? And we don't want that. We want something that gives us a little bit more confidence that what we did was find the best person for the job, given the selection pool that we had. So we use a variety of tools, even with the errors attached to them, because we want to assess the entire person, all aspects of their personality, the KSAs that we want to look at, all aspects of those KSAs, so that it can improve the effectiveness of our decision making. Every decision we make is fraught with bias, and anybody who studies decision making understands that. We all have errors in decision making. What we want to do is try to minimize them as best as possible. That's the most important factor to consider. In our next slide, we're getting at this issue of standardization and norms. When we have standardized measures, I'm not talking about statistical standardization so that we can compare one measure using one scale to another measure using a different scale. We've already talked about that in one of the first measurement lectures. But what we're talking about is standardization of the way that we administer the tests and the way that we use the questions. And so when we talk about a standard interview, right? We want to make sure every interviewer is asking the same questions of our applicants. We want to make sure we have something against which to compare one candidate to another. And if we ask them different questions, we cannot make a comparison, and we cannot make a fair comparison, right? So you have to have similar questions, similar administration, similar conditions, so that we give a fair shot to everybody in terms of what they're asked and why. Next is with respect to the norms. The norms are basically when we give a wide group of people an assessment method, we want to look at sort of the boundary conditions within which the distribution of scores will fall. So a standardized sample is a group of respondents whose scores are used to establish the norms. And so it might be that I design a measure, and I've done a lot of research on this, and I've come up with really good questions, and I'm validating it, and I'm going to give these tests to my current employees. And that's great, because your current employees should perform well on your instrument because they're already in your company and they're already performing well and they're already working on the job. This is sort of getting at that current validity issue, as we talked about in our in the previous little lecturette on validity stuff. Concurrent validity is getting at, if I give all the employees in my company right now and test, and then I look at how they did in their last performance appraisal, there should be a high correlation between the two. That good performers on the test should also be good performers on the job right now. So we want to make sure that we recognize that we can create some really good norms. But here's the thing. We don't know what the true low end of the scale would be. For example, what if somebody would perform well on the job, but we didn't hire them? Or what if somebody scored below the lowest person on our company? Does that mean that they wouldn't have performed well in our company? We don't know that for sure. And let me give you an example of that. If, for example, I validate my new selection assessment tool, and the person in my company with the lowest possible score was, say, a 100, but the highest was a 150. So the people in my company range between 100 and 150. Does that mean that 100 is my cutoff score? It might, but it might not, and we have to be really careful. What if somebody comes in and scores 95? Would that person have been successful on the job? We don't know that. We don't know the lower bound for what would have been a good norm for this particular pool. So we also have to be very careful about, certainly the upper end is not a problem, but the lower end, what's the lowest possible cutoff score? We don't know what that is yet. We would need some time and some statistical analysis to be able to assess whether or not we are setting it too high or too low. And what if, we validate it in our company and maybe we set the cutoff score too low and we're hiring people that don't do well. So it is really important that we have a good range of norms, but we also be open to the fact that we may need to have reestablished those norms as we get more information over time. The next thing that we want to get at is the difference between objective measures and subjective measures. Objective measures are things that are measured that have no judgment attached to them. For example, a typing test. I can't assign you a typing test and have you do the typing test and look at it and have the result of the typing test be something that I interpret. I mean, we have objectivity in, if you can do 100 words a minute versus 20 words a minute, we know that the 100 words a minute is a much better typing test than in a performance than somebody who did 20 words a minute. So multiple choice exams are a great example of an objective measure. The number of words typed per minute is an objective measure because we have clarity about what is a good score and what is a poor score. The closer, for example, on a test that you perform closer to 100%, the better off you are. It's objective, right? Subjective measures are much more about interpretations. And when we are allowing subjectivity to enter our process, we are open to vulnerability and interpretations. So, for example, if we are interviewing people, and even if we have standardized questions, there's still subjectivity in how I hear and interpret the question that someone is answering. So I come in and I say, I love something. I love doing a certain aspect of my job. Somebody might hear it and think that I was being sarcastic. Another person might hear it and think, wow, that's wonderful and enthusiastic. So anything that requires me to interpret the results and assign a judgment to it is much more subjective, and this can be a real problem for us. And this comes up, in essay writing or in interview questions or things like that. This is where hidden bias comes into play. And I had you guys listen to that little video in the legal context chapter and module, rather, because the implicit bias or the implicit association that we make may not be something we're even conscious of doing. And a great example of this is, for example, Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins. In Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins, it's a mixed motive case. Ann Hopkins was considered to be a pretty gruff and assertive, maybe aggressive. Some people thought she was overly aggressive for a female in the organization. Or they didn't say that at first. They said, oh, she's too aggressive. But then when they started evaluating her ability to be promoted on the job, to become a full partner in the accounting firm in Price Waterhouse, they started saying things like, well, you don't act feminine enough, and you don't dress feminine enough, and you don't behave feminine enough. So if you act and look and behave more femininely, you are more likely to get promoted. Well, now we have to ask ourselves the question, was my bias against her not being feminine enough, did that influence how I perceived her aggressiveness? Was she being truly aggressive? Or was she really just aggressive for a woman? Because we expect women to not be aggressive. We expect men to be aggressive. We don't have any issues with that as a society. But we don't expect or accept when women are assertive. And we assume then that they're being overly aggressive. So what I'm trying to get at here is, when I am assessing Ann Hopkins, my unintended bias that she wasn't feminine enough perhaps influenced my perceptions of her assertiveness. And I presumed it was much more egregious than it really was. Maybe she was more aggressive than she should have been. So anytime we use subjectivity, we have to recognize that there may be some hidden biases in our subjectivity and the way that we assess people based on sex, gender identity, race, religion, you name it. So we have to be careful that we are using as much objective measures as we can, but recognize that subjectivity can enter the process, and we've got to be managing that and mindful of that. So whenever we can use standardized objective measures, that's our goal, but recognize that when we are using subjective measures, we have to be very careful that our interpretations of those results are not biased by protected class status issues. This slide is probably the single most important slide that you will be referred to as you think about what it means to set up an assessment system. So let's go through the steps. This is something you should fall back on when you go into your simulation exercise and you have to develop your own assessment system. Number one, conduct a job analysis to identify the KSAOs and competencies required of a successful employee. And part of what you'll be doing in your churns cases for your discussion board is doing a job analysis and determining what KSAOs are important for an employee to be successful in a particular job. We then want to make sure we have reliable and valid measures of those KSAOs and competencies. So create a system for measuring and collecting that data. So we determined what the KSAOs are, right? Then we have to figure out, can I find a reliable and valid measure to assess those KSAOs and competencies? That's the goal. Then we want to examine the data collected from each of those measures to ensure it has an appropriate mean and standard deviation, right? So we want to make sure that we don't have scores all over the place, but that it has a reasonable distribution. We want to make sure, because we want, let me take a step back for that. In terms of that data collected, we don't want to have a test that gives us the exact same results for everybody, right? Because how can I differentiate between candidates? There are no two candidates that are absolutely identical. It'll never happen. So we need to make sure that the tools we're using will differentiate between the skills that people have. So it is important that we make sure that we've got a good distribution and we can assess what that mean is for those results. Then we use correlation and regression analysis to evaluate any redundancies among the measures, to assess how well the group measures, the group of measures predicts performance or success on the job. So we can use correlations. We can also use regression, and so you'll get some practice doing that. We also want to consider adverse impact and the cost of the measures in evaluating each measure. So remember, we went back to our list of things that we needed to consider. As we look at each measure, is it costly? Okay, it may be costly. Does it give us a high level of validity and that it is worth spending the money to do that? Versus if I could spend a couple of dollars less, would I get something very similar? The same thing with respect to the adverse impact. I can use a tool that might be very valid, but does it also have an adverse impact? And if so, we may still need to use it, but we need to balance it out with tools that don't have an adverse impact so that we are not letting that adverse impact have a huge impact on our ability to hire the best person for the job. After the final set of measures are identified, develop selection rules. And we'll get into developing those selection rules later on in the semester when we talk about how do we choose the best candidate in the end. And there's a lot of different ways that we can assess the data. We can use multiple hurdles. We can use a more sort of whole person comprehensive view, clinical perspectives, clinical decision making. There's all sorts of decision making rules that we can use. And so once we have the data, then we have to decide what's the most important factor, and we'll get into that. And it's very important that we reevaluate the tools we use all the time. We may find that the tool we're using is not really helping us make a good selection decision. So we should always be assessing our metrics and the success of our selection tools on a regular basis so that we know almost as soon as it happens when it might be failing us, when we might not be making good decisions based on that selection data. And again, we should also be assessing for objectivity versus subjectivity. And if we know a measure has a lot more subjectivity to it than we would like, then we also have to be mindful of that as well. So the more that we check in on that process, and the sooner we check in on that process, the quicker we can fix problems in our system. When we are establishing our selection system, it's also appropriate to benchmark what we do and what are some of the key metrics that we have against other companies, other industries, et cetera, et cetera. So things that we want to compare might be how long it takes one company to fill a vacancy versus how long it takes our company to fill a vacancy. How much does it cost us per hire versus what another company or another industry does per hire? What are our applicant flow rates? How many women and minorities do we attract versus another company? So all this is information that we can gain access to based on staffing surveys that are out there, just like we have compensation surveys. We can look at staffing surveys that are done regularly by hiring companies. And so we also recognize that some of these metrics might be a little inflated, so we should keep that in mind as we're comparing what we do to what others do in the survey. But I think it's really important that we make sure that we are benchmarking what other companies do and what are appropriate indexes in other industries so that we can see where we're at in the big picture in terms of how likely we are to be able to attract qualified people to our company. This is probably the second most important slide that you will consider as you work through this staffing class, specifically with respect to choosing selection tools. As we said, there are certain criteria you want to consider as you're evaluating them. And here are some determinants of effective assessment. Number one is the validity, making sure that we have a valid selection tool. Number two, return on investment, whether or not the assessment generates a reasonable return in terms of performance. You can have a selection tool that might be very costly, but if it doesn't give you a good quality candidate, it's not worth spending the money, right? Applicant reactions. We need to consider whether or not the tool has face validity for our applicants. And if it has face validity, then it's something that we want to consider because we want to make sure our applicants recognize that this is a reliable and valid tool and that it is appropriate to use to assess them for job success. So applicant reactions has an impact on how fair the applicant believes that the selection process is. And if it's a fair selection process, we are less likely to have issues with being charged with discrimination. Next is usability, is whether or not people in the company will actually use it consistently and correctly. So if it's a fairly easy to use tool, then people are more likely to use it correctly and appropriately. Adverse impact is another factor, making sure that we're not having an adverse impact against groups when we use a particular selection tool. And lastly, the selection ratio. We want to have tools that give us the best selection rates possible. If we have a low selection rate, which means that it actually means the opposite of what you would think, right? You would think a low selection rate is a bad thing, but if it has a good selection rate in such that it doesn't take a lot of applicants to find a really good candidate and it's effective, that's what we would like. We want it to have a good selection rate. It's appropriate for us to assess how many applicants it takes us to get a good candidate. If it takes a lot of applicants for us to get a good candidate, that may not be useful to us. If you go back to the yield ratios, we want to make sure that it doesn't take a lot of applicants for us to find a good candidate. So we want a selection ratio that's actually pretty good.